their discussion on class is, I think, one of the more interesting aspects of a lot of AO. So this is going to be fun. We'll see, because I've got some provocative statements I want you guys to push back on and to sort of discuss back and forth, because there's a lot here. All right. Hello and thank you for joining us today at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. Take 2, we are heading into more of 4.5. We are midway through page 346. We have seen how the capitalist machine constitutes a system of immanence. I'll begin reading in just a moment. Anything going on right now? I think for the most part, I'm actually finally editing and getting these back out, so you might actually, when you're listening to this, it may actually be closer and closer and closer to the actual reading. Look at me actually editing and doing my stupid fucking job on this. I'll get there. The previous couple paragraphs. Go for it, Joe.
Because I think you're kicking ass, man. I just want to note it's a great day for the DGQC.
I agree with that. Previous paragraphs have been leading through our understanding of kind of libidinal investment, how people do things, how class comes into it, how we have interests versus investments, and where these come into sort of the development of not just our subjectivity, but the impetus behind actions. The previous paragraph very much focuses on more the libidinal investment of things and the intensities that libidinal investment attaches to. The way that they phrase it is libidinal investment does not bear upon social syntheses, but upon the degree of development of the forces or the energies on which the syntheses depend. It doesn't bear upon selections, detachments, or remainders affected, but upon the nature of the codes and flows that condition them. This back and forth they keep going through to talk about sort of the underlying nature of what we may claim desires are doing and what desire actually is, where investment's sitting. Because one of the things, again, this whole book is about, is the going all the way back to Reich's question of why do people desire their own repression, which is a deeply profound one, and one that, as I've said before, if you live in America, you feel it more than a lot of people have a feeling as a, why do they do this? And so as we start getting at, well, why do people desire blank? Are they desiring literally their own oppression? Where does desire attach? How do these things work? Where does violence come into it? How does it get exerted? And as we move into this next bit, we start making our way through the machines that we've been discussing, and now into how class sort of comes to be and is sort of taken as part of this. And it is, I believe there's a handful of deeply controversial statements in it that I find really provocative and very interesting. And again, intuitively, I tend to agree with them. And we'll get through this. I'm really jazzed to be getting to this point, though. So anyone else want to sort of give a top line before I start reading? Add anything to that?
Yeah, but before I expand, would you say when you say you're jazzed, are you Coltrane or are
Uh,
you Monk?
Everything's Coltrane.
Everything's Coltrane. It's a good answer. Very good answer. But yeah, just to tack on to that, I agree with you. I think their criticisms are extremely interesting and still very fresh. One thing that's been kind of churning in my mind as we've been reading this is, right, they keep jumping between several sets of poles, because obviously one set of poles is never enough, at least not in philosophy. I like that they're doing this because we're starting to see how, like, we've seen how our reterritorialization can anticipate a possible deterritorialization. We're seeing how the paranoiac both invests the molar, but also anticipates um, possible schizophrenic processes, right? And we're seeing how they co-inform each other. So I just want to highlight that real quick, that as we're going through these different things, right, we're seeing how a series of polarities for them um, cross-stitch together.
I like that. I'm going to go ahead and jump in and start the read, because this section, this paragraph, just, there's a lot. So let's do it. We have seen how the capitalist machine constituted a system of immanence bordered by a great mutant flow, non-possessive and non-possessed, flowing over the full body of capital and forming an absurd power. Everyone in his class and his person receives something from this power, or is excluded from it, insofar as the great flow is converted into incomes of wages or of enterprises that define aims or spheres of interest, selections, detachments, and portions. But the investment of the flow itself and its axiomatic, which, to be sure, requires no precise knowledge of political economy, is the business of the unconscious libido, inasmuch as it is presupposed by the aims. We see the most disadvantaged, the most excluded members of society invest with passion the system that oppresses them, and where they always find an interest, since it is here that they search for and measure it. Interest always comes after. Anti-production effuses in the system. Anti-production is loved for itself, as in the way in which desire represses itself in the great capitalist aggregate. Repressing desire, not only for others, but in oneself, being the cop for others and for oneself, that is what arouses. And it is not ideology, it is economy. Capitalism garners and possesses the force of the aim and the interest, or power, but it feels a disinterested love for the absurd and non-possessed force of the machine. Oh, to be sure, it is not for himself or his children that the capitalist works, but for the immortality of the system. A violence without purpose, a joy, a pure joy in feeling oneself a wheel in the machine, traversed by flows, broken by schizzes, placing oneself in a position where one is thus traversed, broken, fucked by the socius, looking for the right place where, according to the aims and the interests assigned to us, one feels something moving that has neither an interest nor a purpose. A sort of art for art's sake in the libido, a taste for a job well done, each one in his own place, the banker, the cop, the soldier, the technocrat, the bureaucrat, and why not the worker, the trade unionist? Desire is agape. I really like this paragraph a great deal. We're going to take it a bit by bit. I think we have to take it in order. Hey, Ken, what's up, man? Good to have you. Everyone in his class, we're going to start with the second sentence, because the first sentence I think we come back to. Everyone in his class and his person receives something from this power or is excluded from it insofar as the great flow is converted into incomes, wages of enterprise, defined aims or spheres of interest, selections, detachments, or portions. All of this, as we're talking about here, is this nature of the first sentence. The capitalist machine constitutes a system of immanence that is bordered by this great flow, this non-possessive, non-possessed thing that flows over the full body of capital, forms this absurd power, this excess, you might say, on top of it. The nature of this itself is what defines aims, as it's codified into income, codified into enterprises. These define aims, spheres of interest, selections, detachments, and portions. These give us our lot, or are turned into our lot, or the lot given to us during this time, during this codification of these great flows. This great flow that they sort of are talking about here. The phrasing is interesting because when we start talking about sort of the flow of the social or the flow of desire at large, they are talking, and they say pretty crisply here, we aren't talking about sort of a conscious effort of defining out and building political economy that's done by, let's talk through it and have a discussion, and we can do this. Instead, the investment of the flow itself and the axiomatic around it requires no knowledge of political economy, which I think is, fairly obvious. But this is what the unconscious libido does. And it is presupposed by the aims that are sort of given to it retroactively. Again, the thing that they keep harping on, and it's been throughout this entire thing, is this idea of this ex post facto rationalization almost, or this ex post facto generation of meaning that we invest in libido, but then after the fact decide why this happened and call it our own after the fact. This happens socially. This happens as we go out. This nature of things allows our desire to find an interest, and it attaches to where it does, but the desire doesn't care about any specific goals or aims. The line here I love the most, and I'll let someone else speak after this, is um, we see the most disadvantaged, excluded members of society invest with passion the system that oppresses them, and where they always find an interest, since it is here that they search for and measure it. The system is where they are searching for and measuring what their interests ought to be, and shocker, they happen to find an interest there. It is the nature of the beast. Interest comes after it. It is the desire goes where it goes, and then we go, oh, well, desire is attached to that system, and therefore, after the fact, I justify it these 20 ways. A very short version. There's a lot more said here, but I kind of want to stop there and give Jack, Ken, Drew, JK, anyone else who's here a chance to sort of dive in or disagree. It's because I like a lot of that sort of phrasing. Before we get into anti-production, which I think is its own discussion as well.
I want to ask, is it relevant to bring in the idea of the phantasm and the because we were talking about that in the group yesterday. So does this the socius deteriorization of the socius come after, or is that alongside of the phantasm?
So I think the phantasm would probably be the words I'd have a tougher time with, because right about this time is the switch when Deleuze stopped kind of using the term phantasm and began using like BW over socius. They're almost the same things, but he wanted to sort of build his own sort of process or meaning or element without having to refer back to Freud or Plato, for example. And so when he says things like at the beginning here, the capitalist machine constitutes a system of evidence bordered by a mutant flow, non-possessed, non-possessed, flowing over the full body of capital and forming an absurd power. The previous paragraph where he's talking about the full body of the socius or the body without organs. These are the points where he's talking about essentially a phantasmatic element as he's described in Logic of Sense. Yes, I believe so. Jack, you've been in those. Do you agree generally, or am I off? Because it's tough to start crossing those terms because he stops using phantasm. I'm pretty sure immediately after Logic of Sense, because he even used body without organs in Logic of Sense, and I think he just reattached to that, especially after Watery sort of came hard at him.
That's interesting too, right? Because Guattari actually brings Socius. When we were reading Machine and Structure, the greatest Guattari essay of them all.
Mm-hmm.
We were surprised because we actually found the term Socius in there. We're like, oh my gosh! Like personally, I always thought Deleuze came up with it, but Guattari had that in his pocket, just like Deleuze at PWO. But yeah, I agree with you that with Guattari, a serious shift comes, right? Because like just take the body without organs. There's a lot more going on with it, in my opinion, during AO. It takes a way bigger role, um, even as we're seeing here once we start talking about anti-production, between Socius and BWO. You see this too with simulacra, where the simulation aspect is here, and it's implied in the conjunct, but it's not. He doesn't. Well, they don't really rely on the term simulacra nearly as much as logic of sense would have you believe, since especially as we're reading these essays, right? Simulacra is like it's like the byword in the essays, right? But in Anti-Oedipus, you only get it maybe 2 times. So it definitely, I think it challenges some of our how we're understanding the development of Deleuze's thought, both for phantasm and other terms that he had been using at this time. We're seeing like definitely some changes, I think.
Yeah, because it's again we're getting a lot back to the nature of how we generate meaning and how we lay things in order, how we say what we want or our desire. I'm going to use Ken. I'm going to use you as an example since you're in the room. I'm sorry because you literally just posted a great example of this. Ken and I both have the same affliction. The affliction is that there is a particular type of self care TED talk that I absolutely adore hating. I so fucking hate it. I can't even tell you. Now, Ken, I believe you as well also hate these sort of pop psychology garbage talks of, uh, hey, if you just want to be successful, just go be bold. Now, why do we hate them? Why do we attach? Why do we talk about that? Well, we could justify it a million ways, and I could tell you 1,000 reasons. The fun part underneath it, though, is my libidinal and my libido, my unconscious desires, are investing in that. They're investing in that sort of energy, that response, that sensation, because it is pleasurable to me in some way, because it has generated satisfaction, because it can, because that's the intensities of it is what does this for me. And it's a very strange sort of reality because after the fact is when I have it justified. After the fact is when I say the thing. It doesn't even matter what I really say. I'm trying to explain my libidinal investment to someone else. And that's utilizing representation, which is the opposite of being able to do that. So we end up in a really interesting place of our investments are libidinal. They don't attach to any specific concretization or actualization. They're not part of any real, uh, aim or direction. They're just doing their thing. But I'm assigning that aim and direction. I'm giving that meaning after the fact. And because most of us are looking for it in the system that we're in. Um, and that's kind of the second half of this paragraph really deeply dives into what they have referred to before as um, the capitalist. Oh my God. Um, what is the term for having uh, men's genitals cut off? What is the term they give for that? Come on.
Castration.
There's a term for the eunuch, the capitalist eunuch. They've used that term a few times. Marx used that term. Other people have used that term before, and it's because there's this. You're not really actually able to have desire out, and you're not able to positively affect. Instead, you are like the guard in, or the commandant, I should say, inside of the Kafka piece we were discussing last week, the penal colony. Uh, you long to have to long seeing this machine working. You abide by it, you adore it, and your pleasure, you believe, is from taking part in that. There's an attachment there, and that's the second half of this. I'll go ahead and dive forward a little bit, because it's starting to get into anti-production, which is fascinating in itself, because anti-production, again, it's not a thing that is necessarily the opposition to production, even though that's the wording they use, and so it kind of gets um they kind of gets a little uh janky, I guess would be the way. um Anti-production is a thing that basically um oh fuck, let me find, I have my piece on this. Jack, you want to grab a try it
Yeah.
anti-production?
Let me see if I can help out there, because they link it to the BWO and that. Um, One thing that stuck out to me as we've been rereading 4.5 is because they focused on the paranoiac and schizophrenic poles and reterritorializing and deterritorializing, and even so far, right, we're talking about how um, the product of something like an interest can be discovered in the social field, both as, right, they talk about the molecular things that are there kind of welded to vacuoles, right, or like, um, this is basically lac, right? The molar comes with these kind of lackings kind of welded to the molecular assemblages as well, right? So this is kind of a paranoiac perspective on anti-production. But right now I'm thinking about, and I think it's 1.2 where they talk about the schizophrenic process of production miraculating, and then they go into the paranoiac process, and they use Judge Schraber as the example, right? Where the paranoiac process, um, is basically trying to basically cause the breakdown, right? To stop the miraculation process, right? So you have God basically tormenting Judge Schraber's machines, right? Haranguing him, trying to get the machines to cease production, right? Both of which are conditioned by the BWO, right? But at one and the same time, they're, this is how they work together. So that's how kind of how I'm thinking about anti-production here is like it's causing the breakdown. Or to jump back to last section, that kind of it for our purposes in this section, that kind of transcendent death that poses that great problem for us.
The sentence goes, anti-production effuses in the system. We're talking about specifically the capitalist machine. Anti-production effuses in the system. Anti-production is loved for itself, as is the way in which desire represses itself in the great capitalist aggregate. Repressing desire not only for others, but in oneself, being a cop for others and for oneself, that is what arouses. It is not ideology, it is economy. The nature of the production of this anti-production, the way that it happens imminently, the almost obedience to it, the handling of it is pleasurable. This is the thing we want. This is actually the desire. And it's a really interesting sort of setup when you start considering it, because there's a level of, again, anti-production isn't like a bad thing. We don't want to be assigning these ethical sort of judgments on, oh, anti-production's bad. We want pure unbridled desire without anything else or any social. There's a nature to anti-production that they're getting in here that is produced as part of sort of the economy of capital and how it plays, that is itself just part of sort of these larger machines. It's there's a lot to be said here. This is the tougher stuff. Please, if anyone has a question, I'd love a second or two to read something if anyone wants to talk.
I just want to kind of knit off of what you're saying there. You can tell I've been doing a lot of crochet work. But no, to what you're saying, right? I mean, part of this is we're starting to get into some of the more not only social elements, but right, we're starting to talk more explicitly about power right here. So like one of the things that sticks out to me when we're talking about repressing desires, again, how how does this function so as to basically quell desire, quell production more so? At one and the same time production is happening, right? So we talked about the molar, there's the molar escape. We're going to simplify it for this. There's the molar escape and there's the molecular escape, right? The breakdown, the breakthrough. And the difference being, right, in the molar escape, it's about um, basically one escaping as opposed to one knowing how to allow the flows to escape, right? There's kind of that shift. And I think you're getting some of that here, right? Because where I see this point about policing people on that, um, at some level, Brooks, I think you're spot on. It's definitely like the erotics of it, right? We're talking about the consummation where the excess is consumed, the conjunct in that. I think what we're also seeing is that um, at some level there's interest, but at another level, part of what's happening in the molar, um, and at some level it relates to lack, at some level it doesn't. I think what we're starting to see here is how a form of anti-production is actually exerted in the kind of in how things like policing happen, right? So it's not just interpolation, it's actually like one of the things this is doing, and this is probably going to seem obvious when I say it, one of the things the policing aspect does is it moves other pieces of the assemblage around, right? Just like we're talking about moving blocks of debt and blocks of code and flows. This is an exertion of power that moves these things, relocates them, but also causes them to be a different assemblage of production in a manner of speaking, right? It's the difference of somebody, this would be a blunt way of putting it, somebody producing in the factory versus somebody producing in the prison, right? To be really blunt about it. Obviously, there are points that goes beyond that, but just to give an obvious example.
So you're saying that the anti-production is that aspect of that is repressing desire, and that's the cop or the superego that
It, I'm
turns it on.
hesitant to say I'm hesitant to say that anti-production is the repressing desire. It's more anti-production is what is produced when we have primal repression. That's my understanding of it. Jack?
I'm reading it as, for the purposes of, right here what we're talking about, they're talking about anti-production fusing in the system very similar to like how they talked about that, right? Which I'm kind of putting under the paranoid perspective, but I think so. I think they're here tying repression to all of that, but they're doing that so as to say, at least as I'm thinking about it, they're doing that so as to say that the repression of desire and by extension the use of representation functioning at a molar level does this kind of repression, right? It's, to put it really simply, it sounds to me like they're saying this is part of how the breakdown is produced, right? The breakdown that we talked about in 4.1, part of the production of it is through anti-production.
Hmm.
But I like your point, Brooks, because I think it's also important to understand that anti-production doesn't have to function this way.
So I'm just going to read a little bit real quick from, because we're talking about social production ultimately. Want to read a little bit from Holland, just because it's a big thing. The schizoanalytic concept of anti-production introduces the issue of power into what Marx referred to as the dialectic of the forces and relations of production. For Marx, the forces of production are always primary, even if the relations of production determine the form which production takes in a given society. All social activity not related to production in the Marxist framework tends to be relegated to an amorphous sphere of reproduction. For schizoanalysis, the forces of production remain important and maintain their own autonomous dynamism as a locus and expression of desire, but, in line with Bataille, they are given form and purpose by the relations of anti-production. It is these relations of anti-production that organize the social expenditure of surplus in ways that either inhibit or foster the institution of power relations of various kinds. To the familiar Marxist dualisms, then, schizoanalysis adds extra terms. The dialectic forces and relations of production become the interplay of forces and relations of production and forces and relations of anti-production. The alternative between the sphere of production and the sphere of reproduction broadens to include the sphere of anti-production. Finally, anti-production, as the organization of matter and energy flows on the socius, provides a crucial corrective to what Deleuze and Guattari call the exchangism of Levi Strauss. In fact, the concept of the socius provides a materialist basis for what Strauss called the symbolic order, that is, codes and systems of inscriptions that organize desire socially in the different modes of social production. I'm going to keep reading because I think this is important, so just deal with it. As Levi Strauss has shown, kinship terminology and myths organize desire, conduct, belief, meaning, according to codes of symbolic order, as do legal codes promulgated by despots to govern and subordinate people of their empires, and the laws governing the sale of labor and other commodities, for example, in a very different symbolic order. Social coding on the socius for D&G organizes bodies, practices, and objects as well as symbols and words, as it does for Levi Strauss. But for the founder of structuralism, social organization is ultimately everywhere the same and always amounts to a system of exchange: women, words, stories, prestige objects, ordinary goods. However, for Deleuze and Guattari, Chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus is meant to show social organization is not the same everywhere. Forms of coding and systems of inscriptions differ significantly among three ideal type modes of social production they analyze, in part because desire gets organized or inscribed on the type of socius specific to each mode of social production: earth, despot, capital. Even more importantly, symbolic order everywhere is ultimately based not on exchange, but debt, which itself takes diverse forms in the modes of social production, as we will see going through. It may seem perplexing to have passed so quickly from excess and patai to debt and schizoanalysis, but the importance of the latter notion for analyzing different types of power relations becomes very clear. For now, it may help to recall that anti-production is, in the social as well as psychological realm, simply a transformation of productive energy or force, whereby, quote, a full body falls back on the economy it appropriates. The conversion of a portion of the superabundant forces of production into a counter force that absorbs, distributes, or consumes already produced products in the name of a creditor to whom a debt is owed. That, I think, is, sorry for the long sort of bit here. When we talk about the nature of how anti-production sort of plays in this and effuses in the system, we're talking about the elements that are in that way. I have my desires and they attach, and then something falls back on them, and it desexualizes. It's a bit of a sublimation. That anti-production is there, is how I read this. I know, Jack, it's a lot to respond to because I just rambled for a bit, but am I close to how you see it? Where would you disagree?
I, I think I think what you read is very similar to what I'm trying to put my finger on. I'm putting it a little bit more explicitly in the paranoiac. Um,
Get closer to your mic.
Thank you. I'm putting a little bit more explicit in the paranoiac, but it really is, and this is what I mean about all these poles. It really is going to be the molar at the same time, right? Because we've gone through the gregarious and we've gone through how every molar formation is a molecular, excuse me. Every molecular formation is a molar investment, right? The functionality informs the structurality. They rely on each other, even though one is not necessarily what may. It's not to say that structure precedes function, right? We don't want to fall into that problem either. But yeah, I think I'm with Holland because that movement of, what I hear you talking about is the movement of codes and how codes affect flows in that. And at some level, you can put that, I think, in terms of anti-production because, right, it's going right back to the policing. And I used a very blunt example, but we can talk about how we see this all the time on Twitter, right? And I'm sure we all feel it is like the kind of response that's elicited with some tweets or some comments on Reddit where one feels the need to, and usually this is put in terms of call out culture, right? Those kind of selections in that, right? At some level, they're there, but part of the thing that's producing them, to put it in schizoanalytic terms, is right. They're responding to these vacuoles, right? They're responding to these molar. I'm going to put that aside. They're responding to these different blocks, and it's a way of moving them through the exertion of power, right? But also to relocate them in terms of production, right? It's that escape anticipating the escape that they allude to from Blonde Show. Those are the great risks we're talking about that nonetheless we face constantly.
Yes. So it's anti-production is so complex. It's such a fucking complex one. Jesus. We'll be getting more through it as we get into the next kind of couple paragraphs, especially. It's you're starting to hit the parts of the book that I think I'm not saying I don't have trouble with. I think I have a decent grasp on parts of it, but as we get through and we start getting specifics, you're not far off from where I'm at. So uh, if it makes me feel any better, makes you feel any better, I guess. Um, the the remainder of this is talking through the behavior of someone who experiences this anti-production in this way, the ability to repress desire, not just simply within themselves. And it isn't so much that like, oh, repression is sexy and that's what they want. It's the investment happens. And the anti-production sort of comes in as part of that closed offness, as a thing is, oh, I wanted X, Y, or Z, and you name it, you call it a thing, and as you do that, you destroy the ability for sort of, I don't know, individuation and possibility space. You close that, and a thing becomes certain, essentially. That this is why I did a thing, this is my goal, this is what I'm aiming at. And it's one of the reasons that their phrase here, I think, rings significantly true. The capitalism garners and possesses the force of the aim and the interest, but it feels a disinterested love for the absurd and non-possessed force of the machine. Um, the actual force, the power that is in the aim and interest, conviction. When someone says, "I'm doing X, I'm going to do Y, I am that thing," this this essence, this force is what capitalism garners. Yet at the same time, as a whole, it feels a love for the absurd, non-possessed force of the machine. The machine itself, as it functions, there is a desire for it. There is a love for it, an attachment for it that happens. The uh, eunuch of Jeff Bezos, who exists to keep the system moving. And that's what he does. He scumbag piece of shit in a million ways. But tomorrow, if he was really free, he would be able to redistribute his wealth and not be murdered by a lot of people. If he tomorrow said Amazon was going to raise wages by 5x and no one would make less than 100,000 a year, uh, he could do these, and actually Amazon, I believe, has enough money to do that. It would destroy the company. The machine of capitalism would destroy him. He's in service to the machine, and he loves it. He loves it so very much. It feels great to be part of something and to feel like you did your piece. If anyone has been part of any chain of work, yeah, there's the sort of old version of labor where, oh, this is my part in the factory, my world of software. I take my job very seriously. I have stuff comes into me, I do my work, and it goes out the other side. It feels good. It does. There's a smoothness and a simplicity to the movement around it and the action around it. And it's a very human thing to attach to, because ultimately underneath it, and that's the next sets of lines, there is in it a violence without purpose, a joy, a pure joy in feeling oneself a wheel in the machine, traversed by flows, broken by skizzes, placing oneself in a position where one is thus traversed, broken, fucked by the socius, looking for the right place, where, according to the aims and interests assigned to us, one feels something moving that has neither interest nor purpose. And you have to really look at that very specific phrasing, looking for the right place where, according to the aims and interests assigned to us, one feels something moving that has neither an interest nor a purpose. That phrasing is deeply important here as well, because again, things fall back on. They fall back on not just production, they fall back on everything within it. And the aims and interests become assigned to the desiring machines within us, just as much as the aims and interests become assigned to us within a socius. And that final bit is such a great line, a sort of art for art's sake in the libido, a taste for a job well done, each one in his own place, banker, cop, soldier, technocrat, bureaucrat, and why not the worker, trade unionist? Why would we presume that the worker is the revolutionary vehicle? Why would we presume there's anything special about them? It's not. Desire is a gape. It's always ready. It's I have a feeling there's actually a lot cruder of a comment I can make around desire as a gape that I think they actually intended. But I do think that is what they're trying to get at with these sentences and how they're talking about it. Please, anyone, jump in.
So it does sound. This is probably obvious to everybody else, but this sounds a lot like a discussion about alienation. The Marx, the earlier Marx version of alienation, and I was wondering if I'm missing something or if this is exactly what was being discussed.
Hmm. So it's not far from that. I think, at least to me, it's not. I think one of the challenges with Marx's alienation is that the idea itself is based around this idea of almost them being tricked, that uh, their desires are manipulated, um, and that they actually have somewhere in them something more than those desires. Um, does that make sense as I say that? Like that's how I've always read it. Maybe it's different, but worth asking.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and I'm probably just falling back on a very lax knowledge of Marx and alienated labor versus alienation proper, but I think that does make a bit more sense to me.
Yeah. So the alienation within Marx is kind of this idea that, at least as I read it, that as we are atomized, as we are placed into a machine like this, we kind of lose our ability to determine what we should be doing, and we kind of just become cogs in the machine. Alienation yields cogs in the machine. This is That's a sort of dour view of the sense of, oh, well, what capitalism does is it makes us cogs in the machine, but we really, that's not how we're built. It sort of forces us via downward pressure. But I think they would answer that, and I mean they do get into a little bit of this in shortly, but this is more to them about saying, well, wait, we desire alienation. Like it isn't that this is done to us. It's not only are we willing participants, we're almost demanding participants in it. And I think that, to me, it's a nuance perhaps, but it's a pretty significant difference between how Marx saw alienation from how they're seeing it, which is people join because it feels good to do the job. And this is kind of also a core Marx thing. It feels good to do work. It does. Production is like a really amazing thing to do and be part of that and to make. But their argument is that this is actual production. That the alienation isn't capitalism sort of repressing, but instead people demanding to be repressed.
Okay, yeah, that makes yeah, that settles a lot for me. Thank you.
Yeah, it's just an edge on it because I think, as um, yeah, Marx talked about alienation. It's a great quote. Let us suppose we had carried out production as human beings. Each of us would have in two ways affirmed himself and the other person. In my production, I would have objectified my individuality, its specific character, and therefore enjoyed not only an individual manifestation of my life during the activity, but also when looking at the object, I would have the individual pleasure of knowing my personality to be objective, visible to the senses, and hence a power beyond all doubt. In your enjoyment and views my product, I would have the direct enjoyment of being conscious of having satisfied a human need by my work, that is, of having objectified man's essential nature and having thus created an object corresponding to the need of another man's essential nature. This is, I believe, I love to cook for people. This is literally I love this phrasing around it. It's one of my favorites because there's nothing quite like making something, seeing it made, seeing your power, and then having someone nourished and love something you've built and knowing that you've done that. It's amazing. It reflects this incredible power we have. Why would we then not assume, I think what Deleuze and Guattari would say, that our general position in society doesn't have the same thing, that it is us carrying out production. Now, it's production in service of the system, of love of the system, but it's doing its part. We enjoy being a cog in the machine. And that nature of being there, in the same way Marx talks about it, it's not so much alienation pushing down and removing us from that. It's actually that very fact of human nature that's putting us in this position as the social sort of is produced. And how anti production operates is by taking credit for that production. And as such, we line ourselves up perfectly with it, smile, and ask for, please, sir, may I have another?
So he's also describing alienation, also in terms of a psychological alienation, right? That's based on the perhaps the castration complex, right? That submits to the symbolic order, you
Mm-hmm.
know, in the name of the Father. and so that's what the socialist represents, right? Is this kind of a super other signifier that that determines the molecular from this molar point of view, right?
Mm, I'd be I would probably say no. The socius isn't necessarily like a big other or a symbolic thing. It is the emergent pattern of social production that happens under determinate conditions, and it happens to be under capital because of a whole bunch of conditions that sort of set it up. The other socii that have existed, the other sociuses, the earth or the despot, it's not so much that they are symbolic. They are there are symbolic elements to them for sure, but it isn't so much that they're symbolic as much as the nature of how they maneuver production by how they are set up. Um, and they do that by sort of the manipulation of, the filiative and the alliant, the filiative and the alliant sort of axes that our desires actually built from. So when we talk about a socius, it's not that, oh, I'm in worship of capital. Yeah, it's true, sure, but it isn't that you're in worship of capital. That's that's the sort of traditional psychoanalytic view. Oh, you want money. Oh, you want power. Oh, you want this. When the underlying thing is actually the way that capital organizes desire is through general repression that we actually take part in because the general machine that we're proud to be a part in because production feels great and we're producing and we get to be a piece of that by placing oneself in a position where we are traversed, broken, fucked by the socius, which is this sort of weird wheel in a machine, even if it has no purpose. It still feels good because it is, as they phrase it, art for art's sake within the libido. The libido is able to attach desire, force, the things that it really wants. It's able to go, oh, this is powerful. I am part of this powerful thing, even though I'm not really doing very much. But desire is always open and always ready. Desire is agape.
Are you saying that this happens even without the Oedipal complex, and that the Oedipal complex, that Freud, you know, um, how he interpreted the process, became complicit in that process that was already underway?
I would say the Oedipus in the context of how they're talking about it isn't really central to capital. It's a symptom of it, and they kind of look at Freud and go, so here's why you think these. Here's why you believe like the Oedipal sort of reality of man is determinate. There's these contingent things that cause it. One of the big ones is the nature of how we deal with repression and representation at large in a society. Um, because of how society is structured and how meaning is generated and axiomatics is generated, a child in a nuclear family, which is all we have because we're deeply broken up socially, is necessarily going to learn about everything in the world from either mother or father. As such, they're triangulated just by how meaning is given to them. I've always used my son as an example. My son, he's got some television. I gave him one. My wife chose others. He associates Pokemon with me, and he associates Daniel Tiger with her. It's not that it's not that Daniel Tiger is more motherly or that he wants to stab Pokemon and kill it or fuck Daniel Tiger or whatever. It's that the nature of how meaning is produced yields these things. And the Oedipus complex, which does exist, and they do explicitly say that, it isn't that it's determinate, it's that this is the way we're set up. We have general thrusts underneath us of desire, and we fall in line based on how the desire is conditioned after the fact. Like, say, being made and Oedipalized, where we're told, oh, your desires are these things. Oh, so that's what it is. Excellent. Falls back on anti production, feels good, part of the system. Thank you so much. And I get to continue to pursue that as long as I'm part of it. It doesn't do good by us. It's deeply repressive, which causes insane neuroses, insane mental problems, and all kinds of issues with our own subjectivity and generalized depression and repression. But it still feels good, so we like it. And that setup is kind of this underlying thing of why people police each other. It feels good to tell someone else, even if you've done it, we've all done it. explained to someone else or told them how they needed to behave or what to do. I was in the post office the other day, and a woman was absolutely self-satisfied by telling me that because I forgot to sign the thing, and I stepped out of line to grab a pen to sign it, and I stepped back in line, and she went, "You have to go to the back of the line." It was one of the most hilarious interactions I've had. I don't go out of the fucking house anymore. But she was happy to tell me that I needed to go back to the line because I, in her words, well, look, you just weren't ready, and that's the way it is. And it was like, holy fuck. I just burst out laughing. It's this kind of thing she was very satisfied with herself. Deeply. We all get that way.
So you don't think that the capitalism, a system of that has these kind of axioms of power and domination is a kind of culmination of the despotic and the all the ascetic ideal and so forth that came before it.
I mean, culmination may be a tough word because culmination tends to mean a directed sort of inevitability. The culmination of my work is this grand piece I wrote, and I think there's more to come. But in the sense of capitalism is a gigantic number of social machines that over time have been built, rebuilt, left by the side, all the way through the entirety of humanity, and we have a certain organization of it. Generally speaking, at large, we live in a capitalist space, but things are breaking and changing all the time. But capitalism underneath it, how our desire is manufactured and played, going through the nature of capital itself, I don't think that's necessarily inevitable. I don't think it's um, necessarily the culmination, even though it's for sure thanks to the nature of the earth at one point and the way that it sort of shifted and writing came about and then representation and how we had power sort of injected into that because how writing was even brought about in the first place. I think there's a lot of challenges there. Does that make sense?
But it seems like there is an underlying you know uh, uh, power or determinations of power, whether it's capitalism or it's some other system, right? There is this kind of motive, underlying motive of power within society, and capitalism is an expression of, it's just one expression of this power, right?
Well, and Jack, you have something?
I, yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is like we want to understand how this stuff's constituted, right? Because as socii change, we're talking about major changes in conditions too, right? So like in terms of power, just like desire, it doesn't, um, it's not necessarily an essential thing, right? And I think that's critical here because like one of the things I see them working through is to me it's a critical re-engagement with class theory. And a lot of what they're doing as I read this is they're moving class theory to the molar and they're talking about how it functions in the molar. So right, it's not to say it's not real, but it is to say that in many ways class theory, um, as I'm reading it, relies on lack and it relies on the molar, right? And this is where I think you can see some Oedipalization is right. If the that which is the authority is usually the father, right? However that looks, and that which is being subjugated by the authority is usually the child, right? Just to put it in really basic terms, and that's one way of conceiving of power. But I think what they're expanding here is to say that at some level there is that Oedipal representation, but stepping back from that for a minute and looking at how these power relations are constituted, right? If class theory um, and the bourgeois and the proletariat are comprised in at least in large part by these formations of lack and these aggregations, right? Then not only are they going to rely on representations, but class itself functions through a kind of repression as a totality, as a molar aggregate, right? As a molar formation, as a piece of the structurality, as a probability, as we've talked about. So what I think they're getting at here, and especially this last sentence about the socius fucking all these things, is to say that, and it drives at a deep, I think in some ways, a deep assumption that we have when we do like class theory, but also some of large bit of political work, right? You know, unions are always in the right, um, is an older idea, especially for more Marxian people. That was really important for a while, is you had to fight for the unions because as the proletariat, um, not only were they closer to human nature in a manner of speaking, or at least that's one way of understanding them, but that itself was a constitution of a power relation. And what the proletariat aggregates to becomes a fight in and of itself, right? This is the pre-conscious. So that to drive this toward a conclusion, so I can get so I can let somebody else speak. What I see them working toward then is like there's a line in the Baphomet where it's actually the title character. The Baphomet says, "There's no difference between the angels serving at God's feet and the enjoyment they receive in that, and how a wasp feels when it grazes in a navel." Right? Putting that here for a second, we can kind of expand that point to say the kind of molar process, the molar formation, the molar investment that is taking place for the policeman as much as the worker in the factory, the tradesman as they're calling it, those constitutions of power relations are not so different. And if that's the case, that means like we can't just appeal to the proletariat in the same way the Russian Revolution does, going back to a few pages ago. I see them really developing that argument to say, right, part of the reason this is a reactionary pre-conscious investment is it is focusing on not only these aggregations, but the point is to create reterritorialization as opposed to a deterritorialization, right? It's to reconstitute the molar in a manner of speaking, or reproduce the molar, I think is probably the more accurate way to say it.
Yeah, I'd also add when we talk about power relations over the course of the different socii, power itself is kind of a really fascinating thing because it's tough. I think it would be tough to have a discussion in the primitive about power existing in the same way it does under the despotism or under capitalism. The nature of how repression happens or takes part is much more imminent and direct. Uh, Certain people are set to certain things just by the rituals and literal carvings in their body. There's a brutality and a demand, but everyone belongs ultimately to the group. There is no individual in the same sense. There is nothing that sort of goes beyond that. Everything is in service of the group. The move from that to the despot moves that sort of onus and the relations of anti-production um, straight to that of flat, boring political domination instead of the sort of internalized self-repression. So the nature of despotism is about sort of that flat domination. You do what X, Y, and Z. Uh, these people are responsible for this. The priest class here, the caste group here. There's a extraction that happens towards the king, the sovereign, the godhead, whatever it may be, that isn't quite the same inside of the primitive. And in capital, it's even more that extraction of tribute from subjugated and subject peoples is significant play within the second social, but under capital, it's built in, deeply built in to sort of the entirety of it. And so we have this really strange thing where we have less a single person, like the Palace of Versailles, getting just a shit ton of money and expending it in various different ways for their extravagance. Instead, we have a political, military, industrial complex. Instead, we have, I mean, a lot of different shit, to be frank, and that specifically sort of plays in a different direction and extracts differently. It's a different play kind of overall, and ultimately, um, we move anti-production away from sort of this, repression early on is very much a thing that is sort of baked into a person, especially through, again, no subject sort of exists, but now anti-production and production are imminent to each other. They're one and the same. They play within each other, and that change is, I think, also pretty significant as we move to capitalism, if that makes sense. Drew says, I was wondering about desire at gape. The French has it as le désir bé, which is gaping desire, which is, again, I am 90% sure that's a reference to a hole.
It's really
It
difficult
has
in
to be, right?
2022 not to read it that way, right? Like,
I mean, it's everyone
they
gets
are
fucked by
called
the socius. Your butthole's agape. Like that's what it means. Like everyone's butthole is a desire is agape and waiting, and I don't know. There's no other way I can interpret that. I've always tried to be very nice, but that's buttholes or vaginas or mouths or whatever, probably. But it's desire is agape. It's desire's ready to be fucked. Desire is that. Desire's always ready.
well, I'd try and I'm not necessarily opposed to the anal interpretation. Like I said, in 2022, it's difficult not to see that when we see the word agape, right? That's one
That's
of the
fair.
codes we live with now. um,
True.
but that said, we
But
see
that's true. Deleuze never made any other deeply sexual, fucked up references to anal rape at all. Why would he do
oh
that?
no, he was a gentleman and a
Yeah,
scholar.
very much.
But just to connect that to two things, right? We saw that they talk about holes a little bit earlier. I think it's like they're talking about kind of perforations in desire where the revolutionary potential has the ability to basically expand that and cause escape, right? So that's one thing that's here. But right next to it, at the very same time, is that molar problem, right? Because the other side I see to it is, so at one level, right, those holes have the potential to be, um, there's things that can be done about them, right? The molar has the potential to be um, completely changed through a revolutionary deterritorialization, through a breakthrough. At
Mhm.
one and the same time, there's that problem of the paralogism and syllogism, where the lac has that vacuole in the molar that affects the molecular formation, right? They talk about repression. One of the ways they talk about it is crushing the micromolecular singularities,
Hmm.
right? And I see some of that coming through here too, is like those kind of perforations. There's a way in which they can also be um, sort of like a hammer going through the circle, crushing as well. So you've got, once again, you have the potential for the revolutionary reactionary coming through there, as much as you've got the obvious code of gaping.
Is that the same spelling for agape?
Yeah, it's agape.
Yeah, but the same spelling for agape, right?
I don't know that word.
It's missing the accents. I know what you're getting at because they're talking about erotic love and disinterested love.
Right.
So like agape being the next extension.
Oh, the Greek word.
Yeah, yeah. For friendship, is that the
Yeah, that platonic love or the highest form of it, right?
right? I mean,
That's why I had to go to the French because I was thinking desire agape and that
Oh
makes
no, see, I went straight to it. See, I watch more porn than you, I guess.
no way of knowing.
Yeah,
But
not a thing we're gonna challenge and find out today.
No, but I thought perhaps Masumi was doing a little joke there. This is the Masumi translation on my end.
Oh, um, uh, Masumi translation.
I'm off on the translation. Just a second.
It's Hurley's the one I'm pretty sure we're all reading. Hurley Seaman Lane.
Yeah, it's Hurley. I'm reading something else translated by Masumi, so I'm mixing the two up.
It's got his he's got an intro or foreword he writes for like half of these, which happens. But if please upload a PDF if Masumi's got a thing. I always love reading his versions of this shit. I do want to get to the next paragraph though, because it does continue what we're talking about, and I think it gets a little bit deeper into some of the parts of it. Because again, we're talking about libidinal investment, not necessarily the preconscious or the in the interest, the class interest, you might say.
I just want to say to that, we got to be very careful talking about Masumi for legal reasons because otherwise we'll be in Masu you.
It's fucking terrible. You're fired. It's
Or
terrible. You're fired. You're banned from the server forever. That's one of the worst puns I've ever heard. That's some of them are good. Some of them are good, Jack. That was wow. Wow.
some people raise standards. I like to lower them.
All right, I will continue. Not only can the libidinal investment of the social field interfere with the investment of interest and constrain the most disadvantaged, the most exploited to seek their ends in the impressive machine, but what is reactionary? Pardon me. What is reactionary or revolutionary in the preconscious investment of interest does not necessarily coincide in what is reactionary or revolutionary in the unconscious libidinal investment. A revolutionary preconscious investment bears upon new aims, new social syntheses, a new power. But it could be that a part, at least, of the unconscious libido continues to invest the former body, the old form of power, its codes and its flows. It is all the easier, and the contradiction is all the better masked, as a state of forces does not prevail over the former state without preserving or reviving the old full body as a residual and subordinated territoriality. Witness how the capitalist machine revives the despotic Urstadt, or how the socialist machine preserves a state and market monopoly capitalism. But there is something more serious. Even when the libido embraces the new body, the new force that corresponds to the infectively revolutionary goals and syntheses from the viewpoint of the preconscious, it is not certain that the unconscious libidinal investment is itself revolutionary. For the same breaks do not pass at the level of the unconscious desires and the preconscious interests. The preconscious revolutionary break is sufficiently well defined by the promotion of a socius as a full body carrying new aims, as a form of power or a formation of sovereignty that subordinates desiring production under new conditions. But even though the unconscious libido is charged with investing the socius, its investment is not necessarily revolutionary in the same sense as the preconscious investment. In fact, the unconscious revolutionary break implies, for its part, the body without organs as the limit of the socius the desiring production subordinates in its turn under the condition of an overthrown power, an overthrown subordination. Oh, here we go. Oh, God damn it. Where do I want to start with this one? I mean, we can go sentence by sentence, I suppose. Would that work?
I'm pretty open. I mean, this is
Good, then
definitely
you can start.
okay. I mean, I'm gonna start at the end then. But that's what
God
you
damn it.
at a gape joke. Um,
Fair.
so we've been talking about the difference between the breakdown and the breakthrough, right? Another perspective to take on that is the potential of reactionary and revolutionary investments. One of the things I really attached to in this paragraph um, is how to understand that, right? We're back to this problem of when it's the pre-consciousness reactionary, right? One of the ways we can understand that is we're thinking about what the ego, what products of production the ego is going to attach to kind of put it in classic psychoanalytic terms, right? So like with interest, right? Is it going to be the interest of the working class? Is it going to be the interest of housewives in a more classic Freudian sense, right? Kind of early Freud there. Um, or is it going to be the interest of, well, you take your pick here. That's the point of the molar, is that these groupings um, come with that gregarious aspect, right? And in that, there's a subordination, not just like a basic interpolation, right? But they're saying that the molecular gets subordinated. And I think one of the things they mean there is that at one and the same time, it's constituted as the limit of social production. Um, it's also affected in such a way that the production itself is, if not quelled, um, certainly meant to be reconstituted, right? I read that part earlier about every molecular formation is is a molar investment, I think it was. And that's kind of their point, right? Is this is another way of talking about how such molar investments are also kind of ensuring molecular subordination, right? So that is to say that the different assemblages will kind of conform, or at least be um, in a certain sense regulated by the large numbers, by the gregarious, the statistical. There's a few perspectives you can take on it. The difference there being that what the body without organs would do through the revolutionary potential, through the breakthrough, right, is it would basically, it wouldn't be that the proletariat takes over for the bourgeois. We're talking more about how those molarities themselves, those structural pieces, are actually being basically, they're basically being overturned in and of themselves. That subordination um, is itself being not reversed, just simply broken through, right? It's being broken in another sense.
Well, and it's worth going back a bit to, um, I want to say the end of chapter 3. Can't remember which section directly. It's also too, but it's a discussion that when they start bringing up how libidinal investment works and the two poles, to go back to poles, we're talking about the schizo and the paranoiac, as they call it. And we're going to be getting into this a lot in the next like 5 or 6 paragraphs. But when you're talking about kind of that, it's worth rereading a little bit earlier. The two poles are defined, the one by the enslavement of production and the desiring machines to the gregarious aggregates that they constitute on a large scale under a given form of sovereignty, the other by the inverse subordination of molar aggregates to desiring production and the overthrow of power, the one by these molar structured aggregates that crush singularities, select them, and regularize those they retain in codes or axiomatics, the other by the molecular multiplicities of singularities that, on the contrary, treat large aggregates as so many useful materials for their own elaborations. The one by the lines of integration, territorialization that arrest flows, constrict them, turn them back, break them according to the limits interior to the system. The other by lines of escape that follow decoded and deterritorialized flows, inventing their own non-figurative breaks or schizzes. This movement that they're talking about when they talk about this sort of investment of libidinal desire and how it sits, and they do give it absolute primacy over the pre-conscious investment, because we are talking about basically desiring machines in different places doing different things, how they form and how they come, this sort of pure libidinal essence that is charged with investing in the socius. It's investment not necessarily revolutionary in the same sense as preconscious. In fact, we can have two completely different ones, and as such, we're able to have, and this again gets back to Reich's question, why do men desire their own repression? They do in one of those two places, or a few others that they're going to be mentioning shortly. Even if they say otherwise, you can have a man screaming how he's absolute liberty demands it, and then in the next breath talk about how we find that liberty inside of a hyper-orthodox Christian right-wing theocracy. And it's like, hey, let's take a second. How do these? He's invested in those things unconsciously. It doesn't matter what his preconscious is. He's retroactively sort of answering that, but his investments at a base level, they play in those sort of two sides, or along those two poles at least.
Have you been listening to Billy Graham again?
Oh, I actually have. As weird as that sounds, I actually have. I
That's
don't
funny.
why am I doing that? Why would you even ask that? What an odd thing to ask. Someone made a comment about 2 weeks ago on this server, and I got into a discussion about people and Christians and how they sort of became sort of co-opted over time over like 40 years. Last week we talked a little bit about Reagan and a few things. It's just been a thing. And Billy Graham, and I've been literally going back and listening to his old sort of hardcore stuff, and it's amazing. But again, what are people attracted to? What is the libido heading towards? What is the thing that they're invested in? Billy Graham's a phenomenal example of this, because you're able to somehow attach to the way that he is discussing things, to the intensities, to his power, to his push that he has, that is ultimately in service absolutely of the current power structure. But the way he does it and the overall setup, somehow you get to feel, and you get to feel like you're the minority. Like white men who come from a Christian background are downtrodden and revolutionary, and you're the one who's discursive. And it's this really weird thing that happens. It's kind of amazing, actually. So to answer your question, yes, I've been listening to Billy Graham. It ain't just charisma, Jean Claire. It ain't just charisma.
Well, and this gives us insight into the constitution of the gregarious, right? Because, it's not about getting at the essence of Christianity in like an ideological sense, right?
Yep.
It's more about the fact that these kind of groupings function, it's both power and desire, right? Because Billy Graham is not, I don't take him to be like the strong man of that group. The kind of charisma that I think Jan Claire is seeing there, that is in and of itself a relationship of desire and power that is allowing for those flows, right? That constitutes those flows. It's not that, I mean, he is a really powerful speaker, don't get me
No, he's
wrong.
a good speaker.
Yeah,
For sure, he's
no,
charismatic. For sure.
but
Like, I'm not disagreeing with that. He is charismatic.
yeah, but it's to understand that it's not because of something inside of him that makes him charismatic. That charisma would be lost if it weren't for those relations of desire and power that allow those flows and allow those blocks to move in such that to move in the way we're discussing.
If that makes sense, Jean Claire. That's actually a really good way to put it, I think. It's if you removed all of us from being able to pretend we even have an ego or a subject or a name, and we're just pure intensities sort of waffling around the planet as we are now, just say we just did this science fiction. Join me on my high concept sci-fi binge. And we just did this, people would still be like super wanting, like all your desire machines would be wanting to fuck Billy Graham or all these guys, like different people would be, because they're attached to this flows of intensity, how these intensities sort of flow over each other and recognize themselves in this moment. And by doing so, they identify themselves, and there's these powerful interactions that happen at that very base level before we even get to the he talks well, or what he's saying I agree with, or any sort of investment that happens preconsciously, at the base level, libidinally, we're like super into it. And it happens before we even know it. And then, but it works against the left as well, because that's when we hit, I think, something we've seen over the last year, but I think most of my lifetime on sort of every side. But why is it that people who seemingly do have absolutely the most leftist, universalist ideas on freedom and liberty, why is it that like they end up doing hilariously right-wing stupid bullshit in their daily lives, or they become what we might call corrupted? Oh, it turns out they just wanted money all along and they tricked us. It has always been a deeply unsatisfying answer for me, because it removes the lived experience of the person every time, and it just presumes that anyone who doesn't do what I like is like some demon waiting to come out, which is stupid. Well, it's because at the under ninth level, they can be in line. Like, someone can have revolutionary pre-conscious investments. And that means they're like into destroying this or overturning that and fighting the power. They can absolutely have that. Their libido may not match up with that. They're still a little bit behind the times. They're still a little attached to this or that. That's the line they have here, and it's just great. They talk about this. Um, but even though the unconscious libido is charged with investing the socius, this investment is not necessarily revolutionary in the same sense as the pre-conscious. In fact, the unconscious revolutionary break implies for its part the BWO as the limit of the socius, that desiring production subordinates in its turn under the condition of an overthrown power and overthrown subordination. You start in this really interesting way of combining these two elements and seeing how they go, and realizing if they're not both aligned, if we aren't able to do that, and we aren't able to get to the place of pure molecular flows, and also the destruction, or I like their phrasing of the sort of utilizing representation, or the molar as its own, what is the way they phrase it? As so many, God damn it, where's the phrase? As so many tools, where like, oh, those are words, excellent, I'm gonna play with them and build my own shit out of them. This subjugating the molar to the molecular. If we don't do both of those, either can be revolutionary, but you're not going to actually get out of stuff.
And to your point, right, to drive this point home once again, and in some ways this is a very Nietzschean point, um, which is why it can be so challenging in many ways, because it is very undercutting. Like, to what you're saying there, earlier on about like the left and that, it's the same kind of thing as the class conflict problem, right? You can take the as I explained it earlier, you can take that as just one instance of this, where there is a group identified through the gregarious, through the molar, that doesn't seem to live up to what we thought it was, right? To live up to the probability. And this is in some ways understanding that escape anticipating the escape, as opposed to a co-opting, right? Because it's the same point as like the police exerting the kind of policing exerted as a power, whether by a cop, a trade union, people on Twitter. It's less that point. It's more the point that you know that is that kind of thing is very consistent, right? Because it comes with the gregarious in that manner. Um, that kind of power relation, it's not exclusive to the formal institution of the cops any more than would be to the kind of decentralized formations on Twitter, right? Those kind of aggregations utilize these kind of power relations and are constituted with them, right? Uh, Almost irrespective of what the gregarious will be, because whatever it ends up being, if it's the trade union, if it's something else, is contingent on these formations, right? This is why it kind of keeps, it's almost a Keynesian point, right, about the short run. It it keeps being reproduced in this manner, or at least that's the great risk.
And I would add, it's one of the things that, because, and it's the joke they make at the end here, effectively, is that you sort of have this other problem they talk about throughout here about how people are basically still invested in this sort of old system. It's these things don't disappear. It's the things don't just disappear overnight and a revolution happens. It like stuff exists and we need to deal with it and we need to utilize that either as representational fodder for our own machinations or in subordination to it. And you end up in this place where it's, well, why aren't the workers? It's, well, because they're literally embedded within capital in ways that you can't even imagine. They're so invested in the system and being part of it, it feels good. You can see this in a lot of what over time has shifted. I have one of the first ones that comes to mind is I had a friend who I thought was a very, very. It was when I was living in San Francisco. He and his husband, they weren't quite recognized. They were in San Francisco. Gay marriage wasn't legal, and he was absolutely violently for. Like he was it was awesome. Like this fiery, crazy language we'd get into. He wanted to change everything. Lo and behold, gay marriage becomes a thing. He and his husband have adopted. They're lovely people. At some point, he's not for trans rights. And it was a weird moment of discussion because what it became clear it's not so much that he was there for changing the system as much as please let me have my part in it. And once he did, the wording changed and the way he thought about things shifted. This, I think we see a great deal of the time when it comes to the proletariat. There's the joke about how every Trump voter is an embarrassed, a temporarily embarrassed millionaire who's deeply poor or only worth a few $100,000. Tomorrow I'll be a millionaire. There's a lot of people like that. Just let me be part of the system. And it's one of those things capitalism does very well for. So it's why identity politics does so well too, is essentially it's just wanting to be recognized as a proper consumer and identified as such by the system at large. But once you've got yours. TERFs, this is the same mentality. Women for years, I want to be recognized. And then lo and behold, people, the TERFs get recognized, but now, oh no, now we've got to recognize some. Nope, I'm part of the system now. Thank you very much. I have no desire for anything to change because I am part of a machine. And so that sort of mentality ends up being one where it's, where are the investments? Where are the ways that you're thinking about this and how do they line up? And underneath it all, are you reviving, like capitalism as a whole revived the despotic Urstadt? Or are you reviving these old repressions as you do this? And it's a really incredible sort of, again, way to break it down. Drew, I'm going to read your quote from page 279. But the revolutionary knows that escape is revolutionary. Withdrawal freaks, provided one sweeps away the social cover on leaving or causes a piece of the system to get lost in the shuffle. So great. It is breaking things down systemically. It is being against it both levels and multiple others as we'll get into. But there is a marriage to the machine that is important to be aware. And it's one we all probably have here. Like, this is not a, hey, I'm cool, I don't have it. Like, we all have some level of this shit. It's very, very difficult to identify. And so it's just about, constantly being self-aware about it and doing your thing. That's just my opinion. But yeah, it's, I'm always fascinated by it. It's the way that traditionally hyper-repressed classes, once they are sort of gained some level in it, I always love my Irish friends who scream about how awful the Irish were treated and then aren't against like generalized civil rights. It's just like, because now they're white, like they weren't like 50 years ago. So it's just a weird thing that happens. People just want to be part of the system, and it feels good once you're there.
That's a great example of like your point about the whiteness. Like you're right, there was an exclusive disjunction for the WASP and the Catholic. Right?
Oh
And
yeah.
you're completely different constitutions of whiteness.
Can you imagine? Remember JFK gets elected and everyone's like, I'll be goddamned if a Catholic's president. And I'm just like people don't like, that was my parents' lifetime. It was a big deal that he was a Catholic and an Irishman. Disgusting.
But and that's exactly what we're talking about here. Is that then all of a sudden, right? The caplets, that molar formation is now moving ahead, right? That's exactly what we're talking about. Where like it's the same thing for the trade unions, where the representation of the tradesman, that aggregate, can just as easily shift to something else tomorrow. Whether today it's the tradesman, tomorrow it's the guy who has no money on the street. Those aggregates are exactly what Deleuze and Guattari are warning us about. Because you're right, the constitution of power there, what they're thinking about, I think, is more like those kind of exclusive disjunctions would get torn down, would get overturned in an actual revolutionary investment, as opposed to a new a new biunivocalization being reproduced, right? Today, Protestant or Catholic, tomorrow, uh, Islamic or Christian, right? It's in some ways that seems to be where we're at now. But it's the same problem, right? It's that same problem of molarity.
Yeah. And that's the line they have about it could be the trade unionists is again getting to that point where they're like, look, this isn't like, hey, we're on the left, isn't that great? Trade unions will solve everything, and that's all we need. It's like, no, can be any of this. Is it? Are you carrying the state with you? Are you carrying these like old ways and investments with you? Because why not have the worker and the trade unionist exactly as agape as the banker and the cop?
Uh, the the Nietzschean expression of this, and it hits at the paranoiac. The way he says it in the genealogy, right? He actually, I forgot about this. He picks on the Jews, but he basically says it's the one way to say it is it's the symptom. It's the mass hysteria expressed as the chosen people. To put the three thinkers together,
Mm-hmm.
right? That chosen people aspect. That's when you can start to see the gregarious flushing out, um, at least for Nietzsche, and certainly in some ways for how we're understanding the paranoiac here. I'd say that's right in line with how Deleuze and Guattari are warning us against the molar here. Is that that kind of chosen people syndrome. It's
Mm-hmm.
and you're right, Brooks. It's we're interpolated. We find that happening all the time.
Well, with that, I think I do want to move to the next paragraph because we start getting into, I think, a little bit more specificity, and I think it'll set us up nicely for ending there because it moves us after that. Next week, we will be able to go right into subject groups and subjugated groups, which is a big deal when it comes to a lot of shit. So we'll do that next week, and this will be perfect. So I'm going to continue. The pre-conscious revolution refers to a new regime of social production that creates, distributes, and satisfies new aims and interests. But the unconscious revolution does not merely refer to the socius that conditions this change as a form of power. It refers within this socius to the regime of desiring production as an overthrown power on the body without organs. It is not the same state of flows and schizzes. In one case, the break is between two forms of socius, the second of which is measured according to its capacity to introduce the flows of desire into a new code or a new axiomatic of interest. In the other case, the break is within the socius itself, in that it has the capacity for causing the flows of desire to circulate following their positive lines of escape, and for breaking them, again, following breaks of productive breaks. The most general principle of schizoanalysis is that desire is always constitutive of the social field. In any case, desire belongs to the infrastructure, not to ideology. Desire is in production as social production, just as production is in desire as desiring production. But these forms can be understood in two ways, depending on whether desire is enslaved to a structured molar aggregate that it constitutes under a given form of power and gregariousness, or whether it subjugates the large aggregate to the functional multiplicities that it itself forms on the molecular scale. It is no more a case of persons or individuals in this instance than in the other. If the preconscious revolutionary break appears at the first level, it is defined by the characteristics of a new aggregate. The unconscious or libidinal break belongs to the second level and is defined by the driving role of desiring production and the position of its multiplicities. It is understandable, therefore, that a group can be revolutionary from the standpoint of class interest and its preconscious investments, but not be so, even remain fascist and police-like from the standpoint of its libidinal investments. Truly revolutionary preconscious interests do not necessarily imply unconscious investments of the same nature. An apparatus of interest never takes the place of a machine of desire.
Once again, very challenging, right?
I mean, it's just a
It's a
lot.
lot
There's
of
so much said here.
yeah. What sticks out to you?
Um, well, so the lines I like is when we're basically kind of putting together um, what, generally speaking, a truly revolutionary subject might be made of in the two cases. And he says pretty crisply, they write pretty crisply here, in to say on the one case, the break is between two forms of socius, the second of which is measured according to its capacity to introduce flows of desire into a new code or axiomatic. The other case, the break is within the socius itself, and that it has the capacity for causing the flows of desire to circulate following their positive lines of escape, and for breaking them again following breaks of productive breaks. The escape causing escape, the breaks following productive escapes. This is and it's maybe even just the translation, but this is a rhythm that they've used throughout it. Escapes causing breaks, breaks causing breaks, blah, blah, blah. Like this sort of thing that causes and repeats itself, this sort of I do a thing, and if it's in this revolutionary spirit, it's causing these secondary knock-on effects that are not intentional. Like it's the opposite of that, but instead are sort of emergently revolutionary and collide and continue the emergent revolution behind things. And I really, really adore that that mentality. It's a big one for me. So that sticks out to me. But in terms of like difficulty of it and where we can get in, it's the final sentence. Understandable that a group can be revolutionary. We know this. Not be so, even remain fascist. But truly revolutionary preconscious interests do not necessarily imply unconscious investments of the same nature. I get that, but I do not understand this last sentence. An apparatus of interest never takes the place of a machine of desire. Is the only thing I can think is that it's quite literal in the sense that I may have a preconscious interest as a thing, but that interest is just literally that is almost a direction at best. But the machines of desire, the desiring machines underneath it, it doesn't take the place. It can't. The desiring machines are always connecting, disconnecting, producing, and doing their thing. It doesn't matter what my preconscious shit has going on. But that feels like it's overly simplistic for the way that this section is written. So I feel like, yeah, there you go.
I think the thing that makes it weird is like it's such a simple phrase for them. You know, we get used to like the micro multiplicities of desire deterritorializing the multiplicities that follow the ontogenesis, right? Like we just get used to some of the jargon. But I think kind of how I'm thinking about it is like it's like the apparatus is probably tied to like that, like Deleuze's thoughts and what is it, dispositive, the essay of engaging Foucault. But for our purposes, right, I think we can probably just simplify it to it's the difference between the penal colony machine and the molecular formation being repressed, right? So this is basically a point about how um, there is a revolutionary to the molar, but it's not an unconscious revolution, right? We're basically talking about, and this will be kind of, you know, this will certainly cut deep in some ways because once again, the Nietzschean influence. But, it's basically just saying we're changing an instrument of repression upon the molecular. And while that is revolutionary, it's revolutionary insofar as it's subjugating. And, it does kind of, at least it hits me in that way where it's like, you know, it does happen that way sometimes, right? To go from like, I mean, the examples are countless, but just to go back to like our tradesman thing, right? You know, it's what Foucault puts his finger on in the introduction, where we have to guard against trying to redefine rights and to reestablish rights as philosophy has defined them. And the easy example of that is Locke, right? Natural rights. So you go to the Constitution, right? We hold these rights to be certain and inalienable, that all men are created equal, right? This is the kind of thing they're talking about where, yeah, it's revolutionary, but at a pre-conscious level. And insofar as that is taking place, we're talking about a different instrument of molar repression, right? That is changing. There's no doubt about that, but it's a change in repression.
Yes. Well, it gives us a almost mathematical way, algebraic almost, of looking at various what we can call revolutions in time and separate out things, because ultimately we're talking about, on the one side, the pre-conscious revolutionary break and the unconscious revolutionary break. They have to line up. Pre-conscious needs to ultimately be in some service or aim of new aims, new interests, new socius, new all of that, new codification, new forms of power, just like an aim towards new. Whereas the unconscious revolutionary break needs to ultimately be about pushing molecular desire, molar forms being sort of subjugated to that. If we go back in time and we start grabbing random revolutions, you can see actually, generally speaking, where these things semi fell apart. You can go with the Russian Revolution or the American Revolution or the French Revolution, or really any of these as we start talking about what is the pre-conscious revolutionary break that was happening. What is it, the thing they were driving at? Well, it was trying to change and shift how power is set up. I think even in America we could say that. They're wanting to change and switch to a democratic rather than a monarchic, sort of do away with elements and have more representation, whatever ideological bent you want to put on it. But underneath it, sure. But unconsciously, what were they invested in? It certainly wasn't molecular desire subordinating molar forms underneath. Quite the opposite. Generally speaking, they were deeply, unconsciously invested in very much the status quo and the power structures. They just simply shifted kind of how they called it and a little bit of stuff. And cool, keep the slaves. We'll keep women where they're at, and we won't really change that much because we're going to keep the landed gentry in charge. We're just going to make it so it's more of us. And then that Russian Revolution, I think a very, very good argument that it wasn't drastically different in that sense, where you had the pre-conscious revolutionary spirit, so not really, doing anything crazy, but wanting to change it, get rid of a czar, open things up, dictatorship of the proletariat, all these things, but absolutely were unconsciously invested in the general way things were, the system, the elements from before rather than something changing, and the idea of doing sort of transitory periods, perhaps. Let's say you're China, as an example. There's a play here they're making, I think, that starts to open up and again answer Reich's question of why men desire their own repression. It's not so much that they directly desire their own repression, but instead that as these revolutions break out or changes happen, they may have pre-conscious general investments towards the thing of something new and different, sure, but unconsciously they're very much attracted to the generalized power and intensities that followed the gregarious forms of everything, and the investment of the standard way desire is produced and handled. It's a really kind of incredible way that they're talking about it. I dig the shit out of it.
Yeah, to to push. You can tell I've been reading the genealogy of morals again, right? I'm taking a
Yeah.
lot from the first. Yeah, it's clearly obvious, right? But taking the point earlier about you see this with Nietzsche's point about it's why he focuses on the Jews is right. This chosen people thing is he argues that that's slave morality there, right? And it is a form of gregariousness, is able to institute a transvaluation of values, but it does this through resentment, right? It does this through resentment, and that's one of the big problems with it for Nietzsche is it does something he's interested in, but it also comes with this resentment. And eventually, right, to push this into what we're talking about now, that comes, you get the chosen people of the Jewish people transitioning to a power, to a series of apparatuses, really, but to power distributed no longer in that sense, but in the sense of Christianity, right? So, right, we all know the story there. This is part of what Deleuze and Guattari, I think, are getting at is, this kind of subjugation is similar to slave morality in the sense that um, it can constitute a majority, but the more important point is that it's constituted through the aggregation, right? So, it's very Keynesian in that sense. It's not so much that it's a true minority, right? Just like the Christians weren't at first, just like the Jews very seldom are. It's more the sense that um, this representation of the group functions in this way. And right, the transition we're talking about, say in the Russian Revolution, from the czardom, I guess, for lack of a better word, the kingdom, from the czar to um, uh, to the Bolsheviks, right? In a manner of speaking, from the bourgeois to the proletariat. That's not so much a point about the petite bourgeois as I'm reading it. It's a point that um, that same perspective of a chosen people, just like from the Jews to the Christians for Nietzsche, we have that same thing happening here, where you move from the czars and that kind of chosen people to the Bolsheviks and a new form of chosen people. It's that same point about, you know, the apparatus changes, and so too does the subjugation. So you haven't actually released anything, right? You haven't caused the escape. You've caused the escape to basically shut down the escape, right? So like putting in the paranoiac perspective, right? The reterritorialization is to debuffer the revolutionary deterritorialization, the unconscious one, the molecular one.
It's and Ash brings up Code Geass, and I think there's Dune would be another, I think, really interesting version of this. And there's a lot in literature, there's a lot in anime and movies. Dune, just to run with it, because I think it's a really strong version, is, we got Muad'Dib, we've got Paul, who's sort of slated to be the savior, and he's hyper charismatic. And he's actually in the position to completely change how the entire empire runs. Uh, and lo and behold, when he's able to, he decides just to put himself in power and make his changes, I suppose would be the way to put it, and slaughter billions of people. Um, Underneath it, he absolutely he talks and he wants to have these changes. He probably has some level of preconscious of interest in that, just in general. But underneath it, there's an attachment to the way things were, especially as he was trained and taught these are how things are from kind of birth. He's a prince after all, um, or son of Duke Leto, whatever you want to say. But that sort of mentality, I think, puts us in some really fun stuff, especially again, talking about how the leftism works today and what people are attached to. We have someone who's come on the server recently and said things like, Putin is revolutionary. Uh, just the, there is underneath it, the investments and how they play is really what matters. Rhetoric isn't what matters. Not even necessarily what your personal class interest is or your preconscious interest or investment. It doesn't even matter because libidinal investments have primacy. And they're the things that actually are going to shape and change all the aspects of wherever you end up. You could end up in what you claim is a communist country free from everything. And lo and behold, you have the most hardline authoritarian nightmare land that can exist. This happened. These are things that happen. It's just the way it goes. Desire is at the base.
And this is where we can, expand that point too to tie into some of this that, like I said, obviously I've been reading the genealogy again, but to tie that in with the resentment too, right? Taking resentment as a kind of apparatus, right? As a form of desire, qua social production. This becomes the risk too, is that the way that this can change is risked there because there's a form of power constituted through the apparatus, not necessarily against the apparatus, although in a sense it kind of is, but it relies on the apparatus nevertheless. That is to make this transition from one chosen group to the other, right? That's the great risk I see them talking about is that, there is a pre-conscious that enables these interests, but it does so similar to Nietzsche's point of resentment, that being in the position, for him, it's slave morality, right? Being in the position of slave morality comes with this capacity that we see here in Anti-Oedipus being identified with not only the paranoiac, right, but obviously there is a great fascist, or they'll say policing risk with that. It is a very serious challenge they're making. That's my last Nietzschean remark for the day.
Not bad. I'll open it up questions or anything on this before we next week get into subjugated and subject groups. Please, anything here that's confusing or anything we should expand more on. Again, I'm not necessarily going to be an expert on a lot of this. I have my own thoughts, but there is this is where a lot of the rubber meets the road for these writings. So it's there's a lot of hot takes outside of there besides me, and I might be on the hotter take on some of this stuff, I guess. How do I define the pre-conscious? Oh my lord.
There's a few ways. I mean, the classic way is right. The classic psychoanalytic way is that it's the piece of the unconsciousness that the ego is going to work with, right? For Deleuze and Guattari, we're kind of expanding that now to say that like that is related to the molar, that is related often to the paranoiac, right? So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of pieces they're adding to it. But that's why the interests I think are kind of interesting is taking the ego out for a minute. It becomes a question of why do these things constituted through the unconscious and the molar go after these products, right? Why do they go after things like interests? Because the interests themselves still have to be produced. Because this is not a rational, like they are thinking through how to maximize their self-interest per se. This is why do they want those things, and how are those things wanted? How does
Oh, I'm ha-
go ahead?
I'm not even sure we're though talking about things necessarily. It's um
Thinking of it,
desiring machine. The unconscious is made of desire machines. Desire machines are almost singular without aim. They're just connecting and they're not like trying to grab the next things. In mass, the unconscious at large is kind of aiming at general intensities because it's like sexual. It's like, oh yeah, give me more. Oh, there's a lot happening there, that kind of thing. But it's not that thought. It's just the unconscious going. The preconscious is kind of a as to say these desire machines is sort of glob together as they've connected and do stuff. There's a level of development and emergence that happens with this that at some point um, an aim shows up, like, and at some point they become aimed. Just like you need two dots in order to draw a line. A single dot doesn't have a direction or velocity. You need to have movement. You need to have aim, and it's more of a thrust towards. I'm not sure it's necessarily fully like, oh, I want this white house. Like, I think there's some level towards that, but I think there's the preconscious is like a level of development that's almost a little bit before that even, because it is sort of Nietzsche's version of consciousness and the stuff that happens right before it, and that's where the preconscious, I think, first comes in.
Yep. As you were saying that, one thing that occurred to me, another way to say it is, right, it's the paralogisms, right? Because to your point about the White House, when that appears as a lack, right, on top of, and this is the molar now, when that appears as a kind of lack, right, at that point, we're probably talking about the preconscious.
Yeah, maybe. Yes, I think that's possible.
Also, is he talking about the preconscious as in one form is the ideology that represents a universal interest?
I don't know about universal interests. I think a lot of this is them sidestepping ideology, I would say, almost completely. Um,
He does say that in any case, desire belongs to the infrastructure, not to ideology. In that line there, and then an apparatus of interest never takes the place of the machine of desire. So I kind of was trying to understand the apparatus of interest. Are those kind of ideas or ideologies or you know uh, universal kind of interest that represents large aggregates, perhaps?
I think preconscious tends to be towards that. So again, if the unconscious doesn't have any concept of that, and if as they talk about here, an unconscious revolutionary break would be towards basically the propagation of further unconscious molecular development for its own sake, or sort of that instead of in service of grander sort of stories. You might call that instead of ideological service, but for its own good. The preconscious at large, I think, generally speaking, is kind of about playing with social aims specifically. Like, it is necessarily like the social aspect of it. So like, uh, I think I would say I'm not sure if what I'm saying makes sense. I feel like I have a point in there. It may take me a moment. I'm sorry, JK. I'm going to take a second.
In his later book, that's Platon. He talks about the war machine. So would a war machine be kind of a preconscious revolutionary? Would that represent the preconscious?
Yes, for sure. Well, it's not representing the preconscious, but the way that they talk about the war machine, and they do so in nomadology, I believe. The nature of how we would continue a revolution, or how we would get to that point, is necessarily having the unconscious and preconscious interests matched up towards these very particular sets up. Because again, the the way that um, the way that desire and interest sort of coexist, they don't coincide. Desire, again, has no interest. It has investments, it has thrusts in some way, but it's not the same kind of thing. They don't coincide. Um, Unconscious and preconscious things may not coincide at all. They're just sort of around each other. And so, because of that, we have this really interesting thing where a group, as they say, may be revolutionary from a standpoint of class interest and its pre-conscious investments, and there's many of those out there, but not be so, but actually even remain fascist and police-like from their in libidinal. It's again how we sort of allow these things to be. If desire is being utilized in service of representation and aimed at that, and going sort of with the paranoiac or nostalgic or any of those that's driving at the things we know, which desiring machines are more than happy to. They kind of, they're idiots. They don't understand that shit. That's not great. Even if you're, oh, I really want to go for a communist society, you know, the one we've talked about for so many years, and it's that representation that you're in service of, you're breaking anything that may be, because unconsciously you actually have a very specific representation of that. And like a lot of tanky groups and a lot of pseudo leftist groups, you become internally fascist and police-like because your libidinal investments are so deeply attached to representation in general. Selection does not presuppose a primary gregariousness. Oh, no, very much this is about aleatory phenomena. That's a big deal for Deleuze through logic of sense. Sorry, Drew is throwing out a handful of quotes from the book that absolutely is very much about that. I think JK and Jack, who've been in a lot of, or all of, the logic of sense readings, would agree. It's a big deal for them. Well, for him especially.
You said something earlier that I liked. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Well, I've never said anything anyone's liked. Don't lie.
Hey, listen, babe. No, but you're saying something about damn, recording bot. Help me out here.
No, take a second. You can ignore me because I just want to read a little bit from Holland again, because I do like his summary of this. Investment is not for Deleuze and Guattari a matter of ideology, of interests misunderstood or led astray. It is a matter of desire, and of how and where desire can invest a greater degree of force and power, even from a distance, or even against one's interests. And he puts that in quotes. The most disadvantaged, the most excluded members of society invest with passion the system that oppresses them. They always find an interest in it, since it is there that they search for and measure it. Which I think is a deeply profound sentence, because that last bit, it is in the system that they search for and measure it. When we talk about what an investment is from a preconscious state, where are you finding your investments and interests, your preconscious ones? If you're a proletariat and you call yourself one, you're searching and finding your investments inside of what we currently have as representational understandings and a network effect around what communism may have been called at one point or another. Do you know how irrelevant that is to literally everything? But you will say, I am an actual leftist, and you go all fucking tanky. Well, lo and behold, what you're actually interested in is the representation. What you're actually for is the story. You're actually finding and constrained to the system in order to define yourself in terms of it. Last time around, I used the story of like high school, and I don't know if it's true anymore. I'm old. It's the way it works. But there's the cool kids, and then there's the kids who like, oh, I hate the cool kids. And you literally defined yourself by doing whatever they didn't. South Park has them as the emo kids, and the emo kids are like a perfect example of this. But it's an old trope where in order to not be part of the system, you just triangulate yourself directly opposed to it. And lo and behold, you have found your interest in the system, because that is where you search for and measure it. It's that investment in the system is as powerful as anything else. And it's one of those things that it's worth realizing they hear. And it's what I love. Their huge push is much more, we actually need to be in service of new and the molecular, and it's got to come at every level, not just, hey, I want a new society, but I'm going to invest in these things over here still. That's the break. And this is how we get to the place where they say things like there is no, the proletariat isn't necessarily where we find the power or the revolutionary spirit. We need to get outside of these thoughts and start breaking apart from it. And we will get to that, because next week it is subject and subjugated groups. And I highly suggest pre-reading the next 2 or 3 paragraphs. if you have questions, please post in here, and we will discuss, because it is a significantly complex subject, but a very good one too. So I do suggest it. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the recording and say thank all of you for joining. This is wonderful as always. Thanks so much. Highlight of my week.
That's been a fun one.